evening. I'm Barbara Mead. I'm one of the founders of Politics and Prose, and I've come in this evening to introduce Gregg Herken, who actually I have introduced once before for Brotherhood of the Bomb, which was published about 5 years ago. Was it? Almost 12 years ago. Woo! Sorry about that. But that was a book that won the it was a finalist for the Los Angeles Times History Book Prize in 2003. The Brotherhood of the Bomb, that was about the lives of Robert Oppenheimer, Ernest Lawrence, and Edward Teller. Gregg Herken is an emeritus professor of history at the University of California. He was in the University of California at Santa Cruz's first graduating class. He graduated with honors in history and the highest honors in government. Then he went on and received his PhD in modern diplomatic history from Princeton, and he has taught at Oberlin, Yale, Caltech, and the University of California at Merced. He was also here in the from 1988 to 2003, teaching at the Smithsonian Institution's National Air and Space Museum, and he was also the senior historian there. The last book that we had on a Georgetown club was the Georgetown Ladies Social Club. But I want you to know that this book, the Georgetown Set, is very, very different, but it still has a social slant. There's an epigram to the book that is at the beginning. This is from something that Henry Kissinger wrote. The hand that mixes the Georgetown martini is time and again the hand that guides the destiny of the Western world. And as depressing as that might seem, you'll find out this evening that it's also true. The Georgetown Set, as Gregg will tell us, was a group of ministers, mostly without portfolio, who met mostly for supper on Sunday evenings. Their credentials seemed to include an Ivy League education, but their credentials did not include mental stability. Within half a dozen years after they kind of disbanded, two committed suicide, Philip Graham and Frank Wisner. So I thought it was great on the eve of another election to hear a book about that. Maybe it doesn't matter that much who that we elect, because there's always a secret government maybe operating in Georgetown, which is making all the decisions after all. So Gregg, if you'll tell us about the Georgetown Set.
Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. That I know that one is not allowed to use, not supposed to use audio, visual, or mixed media here, but I do have a little bit of a soundbite at the end that I want to play as kind of a surprise. But I thought I would talk first about how it came to be that I wrote the Georgetown Set. When I retired from the University of California, I wanted to write a book about the Cold War, the history of the Cold War, since that's a topic I'd taught for almost 40 years. But I didn't want to write a policy history based on documents alone. I wanted to write about the people who had some impact upon the Cold War. And Brotherhood of the Bomb was mentioned. Brotherhood of the Bomb was a book that I wanted to, where I wanted to write about the atomic scientists who had built the bomb, and mostly Robert Oppenheimer, Ernest Lawrence, and Edward Teller. And in fact, initially that was going to be a biography of Edward Teller, and I found that Teller was such a difficult person and subject that I abandoned that. Then I was going to write about Lawrence, but I found that Lawrence was really most interesting in the context of his friendship with Robert Oppenheimer. And what I was interested in then was really kind of focusing upon the rivalries and the tensions between the personalities, and so an approach that I came to think of as opposed biography. So I decided I'd try to do the same thing with the Georgetown Set, and the focus would be upon the group of people I called the pundits, the publishers, the diplomats, and the spies of Cold War Washington, D.C. And principally, the Georgetown Set, the pundits, consisted of Joe and Stuart Alsop, who published 4 times a week a column called Matter of Fact that appeared at their height in the mid to late 1950s in some 200 daily newspapers, had a readership of about 25 million, and ran really from the last day of 1945 to the end of 1974. Stuart Alsop actually bailed out of the column in 1958, and Joe went ahead with that for a 3-time-a-week column until 74. And the publishers were, of course, Philip and Catherine Graham, who owned a newspaper that was one of the papers that published the Alsop column. And, of course, Phil and Catherine Graham were also good friends of Joe and Stuart Alsop. And the spy in this case was a lesser-known figure, or even unknown figure, Frank Gardner, Wisner. And Wisner had been in charge of what basically was the Department of Dirty Tricks in the State Department in the very early days, as of 1948, would later go on, when that was transferred to the CIA, as the plans directorate, he would become the director of deputy director of plans. Wisner, as I say, is not a well-known figure, but he was actually behind Project Ajax, which was the CIA's coup in Iran back in 1953, and Project Success, which was the agency's coup in Guatemala in 1954. But in my book, there was another project that was actually his brainchild and was earlier, and was something that was his pet project, and that was something called Project Fiend. And Project Fiend was a plan to parachute what were called ethnic agent teams into occupied territory in Eastern Europe, and mostly Albania actually was the first country. And the idea was that these agent teams would foment revolution and eventually overthrow the communist government there. And this went on really on the American side. The British had their own project called Operation Valuable, but Project Fiend with the CIA went on from 1949 into the mid and or maybe even the late 1950s in the cases of some Eastern European countries. But what we know is that virtually all of those who were parachuted into Albania were almost immediately captured or killed, and the losses went in, by one estimate, to over 200 of these volunteers. And yet the interesting thing to me is that Wisner continued this project through the Truman administration, well into the Eisenhower administration, even though it was clear from the reports coming back, or actually in this case the reports not coming back, that the agents were not succeeding in their mission. So I was interested in Wisner as well, conveniently for my purposes. And here there's a map in the book, if you'll look at it, that it shows where everybody lived, but in a 6 to 8 block area. Virtually all these people who were central to my story, the Wisners, the Alsops, and the Grahams, lived in what I've called the leafy, cobblestone, affluent D.C. enclave of Georgetown. The Georgetown Set would get together for mostly on weekends, and what was known as a Washington custom, the Sunday night salon, or the Sunday night suppers, really, as they were called. These suppers would rotate between the Alsops, the Wisners, the Grahams, the Bolins, and a couple of other families. It's been written already that American foreign policy took place around the Wisners, Frank and Polly Wisner's dining room table at their house on P Street. I would say it was more likely the case that it took place around Joe Alsop's table at his modern house at 2720 Dumbarton that he had designed himself back in 1949. The guests would typically be about a dozen people. They would include typically his affluent and influential Georgetown neighbors. Joe would serve his gin martinis. They were large ones, and there were multiple. His leek pie and his signature dish, which was terrapin soup, until it became an endangered species, and then that has disappeared from the salons. The dinners were actually not, they're called salons, but they were in fact pretty raucous. They were independent for the most part of political affiliation. They usually included about a dozen guests, as I say, his affluent neighbors, but as well senators, Supreme Court justices, some young rising star in the current administration, and whoever else Joe wanted to bring into the circle. The dinners were variously described as exhilarating or terrifying, that the advice that, and sometimes both, the advice that one guest gave to another prospective guest that you should talk as loudly as you possibly can and answer your own questions. And also, in addition, the book is not limited to the Alsops, the Wisners, and the Graham. I was also interested, in fact, initially my concept for the book was to write a book about Paul Nitze and George Kennan, but that had already been done. But so instead, I now included the Russia hands, who were not in the Georgetown set, but they were certainly of the Georgetown set, and that includes people, Soviet experts like Chip Bolin, George Kennan, and Paul Nitze. Kennan being perhaps the most famous, since he was the author of the containment doctrine that guided American policy toward the Soviet Union, really from Truman to Reagan. But at the outset, I had mentioned, referred to Brotherhood of the Bomb. In the case of that book, there is one figure who comes to dominate, who becomes the centerpiece of the book, simply because he's so fascinating, and that's Robert Oppenheimer. And pretty much the same thing occurs in the Georgetown set, that the individual who becomes dominant there is really Joe Alsop. And it's Joe who really takes over the narrative. So for the most part, I'm going to talk for the rest of my time about Joe Alsop. I'd say that one reason the Allsop family is interesting, I would argue, is that they are an old-line Republican family related through marriage to the Oyster Bay Roosevelts, but they were nonetheless supporters of liberal Democrats like Adlai Stevenson. The family were quintessentially WASPs, with a history in America that went back to before the Revolution. Joe's ancestors included sea captains involved in the West Indies rum trade, and Stewart Alsop believed actually also involved in the opium trade. Brother Stewart was known as the kinder, gentler Alsop. He was also referred to as a more human version of his older brother. Joe, by comparison, was excitable, irascible, and controversial. But I think it's also fair to say that together as journalists, they had an intuitive sense for stories that were likely to develop into something important. Over the years, they would be credited with various scoops and breaking news stories. They were among the first to warn of the Soviet threat of Soviet expansionism and also of the danger of nuclear war. They wrote a column, actually an article, in the Saturday Evening Post in January 1946 that was a pretty prophetic vision of what the Soviet-American nuclear arms race would become, titled "Your Flesh Should Creep." And the following year, there were also advocates and promoters, along with Phil Graham in his newspaper, of the Truman Doctrine, the Marshall Plan, and Joe and Stewart were early advocates of a civilian Central Intelligence Agency that would be a counter to the operations of the FBI. They were particularly concerned that J. Edgar Hoover, having taken over domestic intelligence, would now take over foreign intelligence now that the OSS was gone, and they very much opposed that. And in the process, Joe Alsop very much became an enemy identified by J. Edgar Hoover. Critics of the Alsops claim that they typically went too far in their constant warnings of imminent disaster. They were dubbed the Brothers Cassandra, the Brothers Grimm, Old Doom and Gloom. One critic said their column should be called Not Matter of Fact, but For Whom the Bell Tolls. Nonetheless, as I say, they were among the first to not only write about the danger of Soviet expansionism, but also to warn of the danger of an overreaction to that threat at home. As early as March 1950, they had just, in fact, a few weeks after Senator Joe McCarthy's speech warning of a communist conspiracy in the State Department. That was in the Wheeling, West Virginia speech in February 1950, where he said that there were 89 communists, or 251, or whatever the number was. It did fluctuate. The brothers warned that McCarthy and his allies posed a fundamental threat to liberty in this country. By comparison, or incidentally, Edward R. Murrow, who was the hero of the movie, whose name I'm will now block, Good Night and Good Luck, that his See It Now television show featuring McCarthy was actually not until March 1954, more than 4 years after the Alsops had already taken on McCarthy. Stewart Alsop was also the first to warn the following year, 1955, that the Soviet Union would probably beat the United States into space with an Earth-orbiting satellite, 2 years before the launch of Sputnik. And Joe Alsop would lead a personal crusade to awaken the country to what he called the danger of a widening missile gap, where the Soviet Union had stolen a march on the United States in terms of military technology and now was building intercontinental range ballistic missiles at a faster rate than the U.S. And he warned that this danger would only increase over time. Just parenthetically, it's kind of interesting to me that Joe's missile gap stories that he wrote about, why he wrote in particular about that issue, the issue of the missile gap, because one of the people who was at the dinners fairly often on Sunday night was Richard Bissell, and Richard Bissell was the successor to Frank Wisner in the Plans Directorate at CIA, and Bissell was also head of the CIA's Overhead Reconnaissance Project. So Bissell was the one who was running the U-2s and later the Corona reconnaissance satellite. So in other words, Bissell is the guy who would have known that there was no evidence that there was a missile gap, or in fact, as it turned out, that there was a missile gap, but it favored the United States, ultimately by a factor of something like 10 to 1. But there's a possible explanation. So my point being that Bissell certainly was in a position to have told Joe Alsop, Joe, you should back off on the missile gap stories because there's no evidence for it. But it is also true that Joe Alsop was a friend of John Kennedy's, and that John Kennedy was able to use the missile gap quite effectively in the 1960 campaign, and that Joe, in fact, had told friends that he would do almost anything to see Kennedy elected president. Well, the friendship between Kennedy and Joe Alsop is well documented. They had become friends when JFK was still a senator, when he and Jackie lived on N Street, just around the corner from Joe. And you probably know the story that on inauguration night, after attending the inaugural ball, that Jackie would go back to the White House, and John Kennedy would go to Joe's house at Dumbarton Avenue and would be there until 3:40 in the morning, drinking champagne, but not eating the terrapin soup, which he avoided. Which he couldn't stand, in fact. It is also the case, and Joe, in fact, in his memoir, calculated that John Kennedy would come to his house on an average of once a fortnight, sometimes with Jackie, sometimes alone. And as a result, it's been speculated that Joe's house on Dumbarton was where Kennedy carried out some of his affairs. Personally, I think that that's unlikely because Joe was also a good friend of Jackie Kennedy. And in Joe's papers at the Library of Congress are the personal notes that Jackie sent to Joe, thanking him for his advice, including his advice that John Kennedy should run for president. It's the only game that's worth the candle. And also giving her advice on other matters, including matters of couture, that Joe advised Jackie that to show more of a common touch, that when she was pregnant, she should get the maternity clothes not from Givenchy, but from Bloomingdale's. Well, the influence that the Georgetown Set and Joe Alsop had in Washington, I think, is all the more surprising since Joe had a secret. And it was a secret that was not very well kept among the powerful in the Capitol, but did not become publicly known until after Joe's death in 1989. And that was the fact that he was gay, and that he, in fact, had been ensnared in a homosexual honey trap at a Moscow hotel in 1957, which is the only time Joe went to Moscow. That he had been seduced by a KGB agent by the name of Boris at the Grand Hotel, and that immediately after what the Russians called the act, two KGB agents burst into the room and showed Joe photographs of he and Boris naked, and said in effect that you had better cooperate with us for the cause of peace. Well, Joe at that point, according to a later account he wrote, said that he thought that suicide might be the only way out, but he thought about it, then he had second thoughts and thought, well, he will play the game out to see where it leads, and he contacted his Georgetown friend and former neighbor, Chip Bolin, who was then the U.S. ambassador in Moscow, and said that he had been caught in, just briefly been caught in this situation. Chip Bolin then contacts Frank Wisner, again the other Georgetown friend and neighbor, who's now head of the plans directorate at CIA, and says, this is the situation, what should Joe do? Wisner says, well, Joe, in order to pull the sting from the blackmail threat by the KGB, needs to write a detailed account exactly of what happened and to send that to the FBI, or send it actually to the CIA, and it'll be sent then to the FBI. And in fact, through the Freedom of Information Act, I was able to get what the CIA, or actually what J. Edgar Hoover, they called Joe's Confession, which is 8.5 pages, single-spaced, detailed account of exactly what had happened. Actually written with a sort of journalistic flair. He describes exactly what the KGB agents looked like and what they were wearing, and one was smoking a cigarette, and it was obviously Turkish tobacco, and so it got written almost like a column. But it very closely held. It was sent then to Allen Dulles, and I have the Allen Dulles classified at top secret, eyes only, passed it along, as he said, as he promised he would, as he had to J. Edgar Hoover. And Hoover then had in his hands a document with which he could use to, I think he hoped to blackmail Allsop. So I think one of the most impressive things about Joe Alsop is that he refused to be intimidated either by the KGB threat of blackmail or by J. Edgar Hoover's subsequent threat, since Hoover basically spread the word of of the Moscow incident to various people who were also Joe's enemies in Washington, including Eisenhower's Attorney General William Rogers, and it did circulate at high levels, but it did not become public. And Joe's columns remained anti-Soviet, anti-Eisenhower, and anti-Hoover. But the secret remained, actually, and it's even remained later, in 1970, some 13 years after the original affair, when the pictures began to show up in the mailboxes in Washington of Joe's enemies, and strangely enough, actually some of his friends as well. They were sent anonymously. The pictures were sent with an accompanying letter, and I was able to get a copy of the letter actually from the family, the Alsop family. And they were sent to people like Art Buchwald, which is sort of a strange choice, except if you know that Art Buchwald that same year in 1970 wrote and produced a play on Broadway called Sheep on the Runway that featured a columnist, an influential political Washington-based columnist by the name of Joe Mayflower, who goes to a mythical kingdom in the Himalayas where there is an insurrection from the north by a warlord from the north, and by his columns creates American intervention, that the Pentagon launches an airstrike. The airstrike unfortunately destroys the palace, not the warlord, and the warlord takes over. But it all turns out well in the end because the warlord is actually working for the CIA. So, and Joe hated this. I mean, it resonated a certain, as you can imagine, a certain bit with Joe's columns about Vietnam. He was very much, from the beginning and consistently throughout, a hawk on Vietnam. But Joe hated the play, and he actually told his friends not to go to it. They went in disguise anyway, and the play would have been probably a flop on Broadway, except that the gossip columnist of the Washington Post wrote that Joe Alsop hated the play, was threatening to sue Art Buchwald over it, had asked his friends Kay Graham and Ben Bradley to at least persuade Buchwald to change the name of the main character, and Buchwald refused to. So the play became somewhat of a minor hit on Broadway. I'll just say that part of my research was to try to figure out who all had received these photographs. I'd been told by one person who sort of knew about this that Ben Bradley was one of those people. We were just talking earlier about Bradley. I had interviewed him back in 2009. I did not know then this story to ask him. I went back to him in 2011 with another question. I finally wrote a letter to him in 2012, but by then I didn't. It was too late, and I did not get a response. But the story I had been told is that Ben Bradley had been one of the people who had received the pictures. I know Phil Jalen, actually, who was the editor of the editorial page of the Post at that time, but would have worked for Bradley since Bradley was the executive editor at this point. That Jalen had also received the photographs. Buchwald said he burned them. Richard Helms, who at that point, by 1970, was director of the CIA, said that he went to, either he or one of his agents went to the KGB and basically said, knock this off, and there were no further incidents where the photos were sent, supposedly. And there's been speculation, and if you saw the play The Columnist with John Lithgow that was on Broadway in 2012, the speculation that it was J. Edgar Hoover who had the photos. I think it was actually Anatoly Dobrynin, who was the Soviet ambassador, and the timing lines up because Joe had just written a column that was very critical of Soviet policy in the Middle East and personally critical of Dobrynin, whom he called a liar and who he said should be declared persona non grata and sent back to Moscow. And it was shortly after that the pictures appeared. And even though Joe did not moderate his criticism of the Soviet Union, he would never again write a personal column that was critical of Dobrynin. Well, ultimately, I think it has to be said that Joe was a sad and somewhat tragic figure finally at the end because of his stand on the Vietnam War. He and his brother wrote a column in 1953 titled Where is Dien Bien Phu?, where he and Stewart were first to warn that this issue in Indochina involving the communist insurgency was going to be a long-term problem for the United States, and that, in fact, the United States should help the French. Otherwise, we are likely to get involved in this, and of course, he was prophetic about that as well. Once American involvement began in Vietnam, Joe continually urged further involvement, more troops, more treasure, more effort, and he really continued that throughout really all the administrations, throughout Eisenhower, throughout Kennedy, throughout Johnson. And into the Nixon administration. Even after the Tet Offensive in February of 1968, Joe was still arguing what he had argued back in 1965 with a phrase that he had made famous, that there was still light at the end of the tunnel. And he was anomalous, certainly, among American reporters in holding that view at this point and being very much a hawk on Vietnam. Walter Lippmann, who was Joe's rival on the editorial page of the Post and other papers, once said that he blamed Alsop as much as Lyndon Johnson for escalating the war because it was Alsop who urged Johnson to continue the escalation and not to be the first president to lose a war. Joseph Kraft of the New York Times said that if there was ever a war crimes trial for Vietnam, it was Joe who deserved to be in the dock, since it was he who had persuaded John Kennedy to get involved in the first place. So on Vietnam, as on other issues including gender equality and civil rights, Joe was increasingly out of step with the country that he'd been writing about for more than a generation. He wrote his last column in December 1974, just a few months before North Vietnamese troops overran Saigon, and 6 months after his brother Stuart had died of leukemia. He was bitter. He decided he would retire. His column was down to was a syndicated column. The syndicate had only been picked up by 50 newspapers, continued by that time. So Joe pledged that he would end his career as a columnist, and he would not write again about politics, which is not quite a promise he kept, but he did turn his efforts to writing a book about collecting rare art instead. In 1987, he began his memoirs, which would end deliberately and abruptly in November 1963 with the assassination of President Kennedy, where Joe wrote, and this is basically the end of his memoir, but clearly after that bright, blustery November day, nothing would be quite the same in my life again, or it hardly needs saying, in the life of this country. He titled the book, I've Seen the Best of It, which was actually a quote from his brother, Stuart, when Stuart lay dying. In 1988, just a year before his death of lung cancer, Joe confessed in a letter to his stepson, Billy, that he was the sole survivor of the era that he had dubbed from the beginning the WASP ascendancy, a world that he wrote that was now as dead as the Auk. Well, on other venues, I've been able to show pictures of Joe's house and of Joe and of Susan Mary and a few others, and I don't really have enough time to do that here, but I do have something that is almost as good, which is a telephone conversation between Joe Alsop and Lyndon Johnson. It takes place in, I'm going to just play, it's a 15-minute long conversation. I'm going to play 1 minute of it, but I think you get the essence of Joe Alsop. I should give you the date is November 25th, 1963, so it is 3 days after the assassination of President Kennedy. And Joe is worried that Johnson is going to give the investigation of Kennedy's assassination over to J. Edgar Hoover and leave it there, and Joe doesn't trust Hoover. And so he calls up Johnson to persuade Johnson to instead appoint an independent commission to investigate the death of the president. And also Joe doesn't want Bobby Kennedy to investigate the death of his own brother. So you'll hear the voice here, if things work out, of Joe Alsop and talking to Lyndon Johnson. And I think you get some sense of what, at least what Joe sounded like and how he operated. Joe's voice, by the way, has been variously described as Groton Lockjaw, a blend of Connecticut Yankee and Harvard Yard, and Charles Lawton playing Oscar Wilde. So you can judge for yourself if this works out. So we'll start this in sort of mid conversation.
Himself into local. When the
yes, well, you go back to that again.
How to put it on this one?
Blue ribbon. American jurists beyond, or individuals, Dean Acheson, for example. 2 or 3 individuals beyond any possible suspicion as to their independence and impartiality to draw up a written report giving to the public everything of the FBI evidence that is relevant. And then you will have this written report, which is not Texas, which tells the whole story, which is based on the FBI evidence, which doesn't need to use the things that the FBI says can't be used, and yet will carry absolute conviction, and will just be that little extra added to the admirable machinery you've already got that will carry complete conviction.
Our lawyers, Joe, tell me that the White House must not, the president must not inject himself into local killings.
I agree with that, but in this case it does happen to be the killing of the president.
Right.
And the thing is, I'm not suggesting. Mind you, Mr. President, I'm not talking about an investigative body. I am talking about a body which will take all the evidence that the FBI has amassed when they have completed their inquiry and produce a public report on the death of the president. That, I think, you see, that is not an interference in Texas. That is, wait a second now, that is a way to transmit to the public without breach of confidence and in a way that will carry absolute conviction what the FBI has turned up.
Why can't the FBI transmit it?
Because no one, again, on the left, they won't believe the FBI. And the FBI doesn't write very well.
Do you make sense of that?
So, well, that's the quintessential Joe Alsop. He interrupts the president, and LBJ was not exactly a shrinking violet, as you know, and the FBI does not write very well. Great line. So I think I'll take questions at this point.
Okay, we've got 2 mics for questions. One here, one here.
Well, I know those were different times, but it seems very strange that Joe Alsop would either be given by Boland or would take the advice to put on paper this embarrassing incident and agree that it would go to not only the CIA but to his enemy J. Edgar Hoover. I can't even see why Hoover would be relevant since it was a foreign policy thing. Anyway, is there any further explanation as to why he did it?
Well, it was basically upon the recommendation of Chip Boland and Frank Wisner that this is the only way, if Joe fessed up what had happened and sent the document to the FBI and the CIA, that the KGB would not be in such a position to blackmail him, because the truth would already be known at the highest circles of American intelligence. So that was... So, and I got, actually, the document was declassified finally. It wasn't declassified until, it was written in 1957, not declassified until 2007, but it was obtained under the Freedom of Information Act. And you can actually, if you go to CIA.gov and go to the Freedom of Information Act electronic reading room and type in Joe Alsop, it'll pop up.
Okay.
Anybody, any other questions?
Do you think that every president ought to be taped from beginning to end?
Yes. if nothing else, only for historians. Because one of the sources that I used in the book and was really quite valuable in the Nixon years were the Nixon tapes, and especially the tapes involving conversations between Henry Kissinger and Joe Alsop. And there is also a conversation in there between Henry Kissinger, and these are transcripts of the conversations, between Henry Kissinger and Dobrynin, where they both refer, the Soviet ambassador to the U.S., Anatoly Dobrynin, where they both refer to, basically Kissinger says, we both know, Anatoly, why Joe is so sensitive about the Russians. And it's a reference to the Moscow incident. So they both knew about that. And again, I think it was Dobrynin who actually is the person who had the KGB send the photographs in 1970 to try to shut up Allsop. Oh, yeah.
What do you make of the odd, complicated alliance between Joe and Susan Mary?
Well, that is how long do you have? Well, Billy Patton has written his own book. Who and in his book, My Three Fathers, he says that he thinks that the reason for the marriage was that Joe was a Kennedy insider at that point, and basically needed cover, and the marriage was going to be cover, and the understanding that Joe had with Susan Mary is that the relationship would be a partnership and would be platonic, but that she would be the hostess and he would be the host of the parties that they held, and it was a perfect role. For as long as it lasted, I can't imagine anybody ever being married to Joe Alsop as an irascible character, and it didn't last. She left, I think it was in '73, and then she divorced him in '78. But I understand that they remained friends afterwards, and they could be seen walking around Georgetown, the old Georgetown. So I think that makes the most sense. And it was there are letters from Susan Mary, and you may know that there is the American Lady, the biography of Susan Mary, where Susan Mary is writing to Joe. This is long after, even after the divorce, where she is reminiscing fondly about their years together. So I think that probably it was a cover.
Yeah. I guess I have two questions, Greg. One, and they're very different. One is the shift in the media environment today would make this kind of concentrated power probably more difficult. I'd like you to speculate on that. I mean, when you have the Allsop brothers and the influence that they had, and that began to wane. So is that a good thing, or would you say that's true, and is that a good thing or a bad thing? So that's question one. The other, completely different, is you've had lots of conversations with the next generation, with the children, with the families of the Alsops and all of the characters that you describe. What's their impression of life growing up in this environment? So those are two very different questions.
Just to answer that, respond to that second question first, that obviously all the principals in the book, the Joe and Stuart Alsop, Phil and Kay Graham, and Frank Wisner were all gone, but the children are still around. And actually, I was able to interview quite a few of the children, and they all had pretty romantic and nostalgic notions of what life. They all had fond memories of. Donald Graham basically was advised on how to write his senior thesis at Harvard by Joe Alsop, who sent him books on, and really suggested the topic, as a matter of fact. And Frank Wisner, the second, who became the ambassador to Egypt, and the rest of it, remembers going to Joe's house and reciting the rhyme of the Ancient Mariner and being rewarded with ice cream. So you see that Frank Wisner is a senior diplomat, the highest ranked ambassador in the Foreign Service, and just to have him tell this story, actually the story that he told that I thought was most enjoyable was that his father had spent all this time trying to overthrow the Albanian government, and Frank the second is appointed to go to the Kosovo talks, trying to establish the independent status of Kosovo, and which would have an majority Albanian population, and he's in Tirana, the Albanian capital, seated at the desk of Enver Hoxha, who was the guy who his father had tried to overthrow all those years, at the other side of the desk was the democratically elected president of Albania. And Frank said he just realized, he savored the irony. He sort of leaned back in his chair and looked up at the ceiling and said, "Dad, I bet you won't believe where I am right now." And that's how I end that chapter on Frank. On the question of whether it's better or not. Actually, I just saw there's a review of the book in the New Yorker, and it concludes that it's better, that it's a good thing that it's not the way it was back then. I don't know. What the big difference between politics now and politics then is that back then people, even on opposite ends of the political spectrum, tended to talk to each other and even party together. And now they won't be seen in the same room. It's seen as sort of treasonous. And that I think is a loss. As far as the media is concerned, they really, I think this is true, that you don't have anything like the power of the newspaper columnist, the pundit, as it was back then. And there were really just a fairly small handful. Walter Lippmann, who was probably considered the senior American commentator, Joe Kraft, Scotty Reston, and the Alsops were pretty much it. And they were read pretty religiously by the population. And there isn't, now everybody chooses their own outlet depending upon their own biases, and it's not going to be a newspaper, but it's going to be a blog or or something of that sort. So I don't think that even someone asked that similar question before, and they said, "Is there anybody today who has the authority or swagger of Joe Alsop?" And they suggested Thomas Friedman, and I suggested Stephen Colbert, but only with tongue in cheek. So.
How did Dick Helms fit into the Georgetown set? Was he part of it?
You know, he was blamed as being part of it. That when Johnson called him into his office and basically chewed him out for giving secrets to Joe Alsop, and he wasn't doing that. But he wasn't part of the inner circle of the Georgetown set. And Cynthia Helms has written her own memoir, and when Dick Helms decided he was going to retire from the CIA, or when he knew he was about to be fired by Nixon, that he told her to start looking for a house, and he said, "Anywhere but Georgetown." So the only part he really has in the book is the business where he actually advises Joe not to make his homosexuality public because it would damage the family, and this is in 1970, and to keep the secret. And Helms is the one who either goes personally to the KGB or sends one of his agents and basically gives the threat to them that if you continue this business of trying to expose Allsop, we will expose a couple of your agents, and we know what they've been doing. Yeah.
So I was just reading a passing remark today about how ill-prepared diplomats were in the interwar period, and how great the professionalization of the diplomatic corps is today. What do your researchers tell us about American policymaking? There is the perception that this was a golden era, and that we live in a period of decline. Is that just WASP nostalgia, or was there something different about these people, and what?
Yeah. Well, I'm just trying to think of the Russian hands in particular, and George Kennan. One thing I do mention in the book is that George Kennan, who lived to be to a ripe old age, that he warned at the time of the expansion of NATO. He wrote an op-ed piece for the New York Times calling the expansion of NATO into the former Baltic republics and into Poland a fateful error. And he said that this is probably the greatest mistake of the post-Cold War era, and that we will see the consequences of this later. And this recent what's happened in Crimea and in Ukraine has brought back that quote. Certainly, the diplomatic corps is more professional, and I'm not really in a position to say whether it's better or not, but I know that Chip Bolin, Llewellyn Thompson were called by John Kennedy his two great demonologists, and because they were the experts on the Soviet Union that he relied upon. And Tommy Thompson had stayed in Khrushchev's Dasha and basically knew the Soviet leadership. So when the Cuban Missile Crisis occurred, Kennedy relied upon Bolin and also upon Thompson, and actually, in fact, the very first day of the missile crisis was the day that Chip Bolin was going to leave, or the next day would be the day he would leave to go off to be American ambassador to Paris, and Joe Alsop had a party at his house that night. And John Kennedy, the night that he learned, that evening, just that morning, he learned about the missiles in Cuba. He goes to Joe's house, Joe and Susan Mary's house, and he's at the house, and both Joe and Susan Mary notice that Kennedy seems to be preoccupied. And when he gets there, first he goes with Bolin, and they go into the back garden and out of earshot. And Kennedy is asking Bolin, it turns out, what will Khrushchev, what do the Russians do once their backs are to the wall? If I stand up to Khrushchev, what will happen? And that's the same thing that Kennedy had done the year earlier in June 1961 during the Berlin crisis, when he sought the opinion of his two great demonologists as to what will happen. And their advice had been right, which is that Khrushchev will back down, but you have to give him an out. And that was basically the same advice given there. So, but just to conclude on that Bolin certainly was highly professional, but one of the things that I mentioned in the book is apparently he was drunk on bathtub gin when he had his orals, and he passed them with flying colors. So not sure what you make of that. And he also said that the two greatest lies in the English language are champagne has no effect on me, and I understand the Russians.
We've got time for one more question.
In that 1949 plan of Wisner's of dropping ethnic agents behind the lines, 200 died, and nobody got thought that somebody hadn't been turned or there was a leak or something?
Well, there's still a debate as to whether it was Kim Philby, for example. We know that Philby was the liaison officer for British intelligence, the SIS, with the CIA on that operation. The British had their own version, valuable. We had Fiend, and we shared information with them. And literally, it was the case that when the agents were parachuted in, there were the Albanian Secret Service was already there to sort of greet them, and they would even call the agents out by name. So it should have been pretty evident. I mean, what's interesting.
And in the other cases too?
Other cases?
Well, there was 200. You said.
Well, the figure of 200 is actually in Tim Weiner's book on the legacy, and I don't know that that's actually the full, an accurate number, but that's the number he gives. But it's the CIA finally declassified Fiend. It's now, the records are in the National Archives, and they're voluminous, many, many boxes, and they include the after-action reports by the survivors. And one can only imagine what the CIA was thinking when these reports came back, because this entire group, they would be parachuted in groups of 5, 2 groups of 5, and they would be wiped out in short order, and maybe 1 or 2 would survive and bring back word of what had happened. But they continued. I think we were so desperate to have a success against the Russians at that point, and because we had this capability, that we carried it on, even though it was disaster after disaster.
Thank you. Thank you.